Hello, YouTube. We're back again with more reading from the Dullahan. Or to the Dullahan, depending on your perspective on things. Either way, we got through most of the pre-Fourth Era lore last time we went through Encyclopedia Eorzea, so this time we're just going to progress from that point. There is a little bit of the book beforehand that I wasn't able to get on camera, and I'll probably do that sometime just off stream because I read it on stream but didn't get the recording. I'll just do it off stream and throw it up on YouTube and Patreon while letting out a notification in the Discord. For now, we're just going to get started. The Forgotten Age. There exist almost no records of the years immediately following the fall of the mighty Allegan Empire. This dark period is loosely referred to as the Forgotten Age, for very little is known of how its people lived. The Fourth Astral Era, the fall of civilization. From what information, mostly based in oral tradition, remains of the early Fourth Astral Era, blame for the fall of the civilization was placed firmly on man's lust for knowledge. People deemed that the answers to life's mysteries were best left with the gods. Pursuit of that which lies beyond man's ken was seen as a sin, and that it was this covetousness that proved the impetus for his destruction. A widespread shunning of any and all manner of higher learning began. Books were burned, and parents refrained from teaching letters to their children. Surviving Allegan technologies were destroyed, buildings were toppled or buried, and the learned, what few remained, were exiled or even killed. Civilization took a giant leap backward to a time not unlike the Second Astral Era. The pendulum had swung, and an era-long thirst for knowledge was quickly replaced with an unmoving fear in the heavens. Stories of the Allegan Empire survived now only in scripture, where the fallen civilization was reduced to a simple device used to teach lessons on the sin of hubris. For approximately 1,500 years, a number long speculated but only recently confirmed with the discovery of an operating expulsion node in Azazla, placing the abandonment of the floating research complex at 5,000 years ago, the silent war against knowledge continued, the church manipulating what knowledge, if any, trickled its way down to the masses. Religious leaders went even as far as introducing a new alphabet for their holy scriptures, taught only to men and women of the cloth, so as to solidify their control over the realm through the continued illiteracy of the common people. It is therefore ironic that this alphabet for the privileged would eventually evolve into the Eorzean script used throughout the realm today. The Fifth Umbral Era, the Calamity of Ice. As is the case with nearly the entirety of the Fourth Astral Era, the great calamity which would end the period is also shrouded in mystery. Tribal legend and local folklore does, however, speak of a seemingly endless winter that brought with it bitter cold, raging snowstorms, and giant rivers of ice. Without the ability to grow crops, much of the population perished, or was forced to flee to the south and its more temperate climes. It is believed that for the years that encompassed the Fifth Umbral Era, or as it is known, the Age of Eternal Frost, much of the blood-brine sea was frozen solid, on one hand preventing fishing and decimating the populations of sea life, but on the other allowing for the migration of Miqo'te tribes from southern Ilsabard into northern Eorzea, tribes made up of descendants of the very same Miqo'te who were persecuted against and driven from Eorzea by the Allegan Empire almost 2 millennia earlier. The newly hardened seas of this frigid era provided the tribes with a means around the massive peaks of Girabania that prevented their return in the Fourth Astral Era, and while there was little awaiting them in the rime-encrusted realm when they arrived, their uncanny ability in the hunt granted them a means of survival until the frost had melted. It was not long after the return to the realm that the Miqo'te learned of the new Eorzean alphabet. Tribal seers were quick to claim that the number of letters in the alphabet, 26, directly corresponded with the exact number of Seeker of the Sun tribes that had made the journey across the frozen seas, was most fortuitous, subsequently convincing the tribes that they should each take one of those letters into its name. It is not uncommon even today for massive floating islands of ice to appear in the winter moons along Eorzea's northernmost coasts, the Far Reach. In the Fifth Umbral Era, however, these frozen mountains were said to have appeared as far south as the Jade Sea. And so we enter the Age of Enlightenment. The Fifth Astral Era was an age of untold wonders, when the arcane arts burgeoned and the great civilizations that commanded such powers flourished. Alas, this Age of Enlightenment would not last. The War of the Magi brought the great floods of the Sixth Umbral Calamity, which swallowed once proud nations and left naught but a battered wasteland in its wake. Okay. The Fifth Astral Era. Seeds of Magic. At the dawn of the Fifth Astral Era, as Eorzea was huddling in the bitter cold of the endless frost, the people of the realm once more beseeched the 12 for warmth. It was during this time that a magnificent cathedral was built on the edge of the Black Shroud, a sanctuary where people would fervently pray to the gods and harness the power of their blessings through the use of magic. These rituals rose in prominence as a way for the survivors of the Fifth Calamity to cope with the era's bleak prospects, and served as a driving force in the realm's revitalization. As the harsh climate subsided, the people once again set out across the realms. Small settlements grew into towns, then cities, each with their own unique culture. The universal worship of the 12 splintered as the denizens of these communities sought to assert their newfound sense of identity by choosing patron deities to protect them. These widening differences in culture, religion, and approaches to the arcane arts would lead to intense contests for supremacy between nations. The first sanctum of the 12 is believed to have been erected around the dawn of the Fifth Astral Era. After years of disuse, the original structure fell into ruin, overgrown by the thick brush of the Black Shroud, and lying forgotten until after the Seventh Umbral Calamity, when it was unearthed and restored to its former glory. In the modern age, it also serves as a hall wherein the gods bear witness to the declaration of eternal bonds between lovers. A precursor to war. Fledgling cities emerged around the 300th year of the Fifth Astral Era, and for the next 2.5 centuries, the number of city-states would grow to 12, each paying tribute to a unique god or goddess of the Eorzean pantheon. These city-states, however, lacked the stability of their modern-day counterparts, and the onset of the Age of Enlightenment was rife with turmoil, with territorial borders endlessly redrawn as smaller domains found themselves ravaged, divided, or integrated into larger populations. By the 1000th year of the Fifth Astral Era, the realm's sovereign nations numbered 6, the most prominent among them Mach, located in the western basin of Yefim, Amdapor, situated on the plains of central Aldenard, or what is now the South Shroud, and Nim, spanning the western coast of the Isle of Vilbrand. In the latter half of the era, the city-states, which had heretofore weathered centuries of intermittent upheaval, would find themselves embroiled in a feud of an entirely different scale. Concerning the rise and fall of the early civilizations of the Fifth Astral Era, historians believe there is still much to be gleaned from yet undiscovered relics that remain hidden within the shattered ruins of the fallen cities. The rush to salvage these priceless artifacts, however, has pit Eorzean scholars in pursuit of knowledge against the avarice of ruthless treasure hunters. The Dark City of Mach. The lands of Yefim are presently mired in an uninhabitable saltwater swamp, yet this was not always the case. When the icy winds of the Fifth Umbral Calamity abated, Thawed snows trickled down from the northeastern mountains of Appalachia to form the White Maiden, which, in time, nurtured the soils of the lowlands. The region transformed into a fertile landscape, and it was near the 500th year of the Fifth Astral Era that the region's people came together to establish the city of Mach. At the time of its foundation, Mach was merely one among 12 undistinguished city-states struggling to survive. The Amdapori were the dominant power, controlling a sizable portion of central Eorzea and wielding significant influence outside their immediate domain. The balance shifted drastically in Mach's favor around the year 800, however, when a sorceress by the name of Shitoto came upon a ruinous form of magic. A tale passed down by practitioners of the art in the Order of Nalthal claims it was Shitoto who first developed the ability to draw upon ambient aether to imbue her spells with deadly power. Thus did the realm witness the birth of modern black magic. The Machi used this newfound knowledge to bolster the strength of their army, and were successfully able to weather the tumultuous ebb and flow of feuds that reduced many other city-states to rubble, ultimately rising to become a substantial military power. The crumbled formations of the city of Mach can still be seen in Yafam's brackish swamps, the enormous scale of the ruins evidence to the civilization's once vast population. Rising waters, however, have since reclaimed the former home of the mages, reducing it to an uninhabitable wilderness. Void Magics. Although the Machi were known masters of black magic, the extent of their power was not limited to Shitoto's school of spellcraft. Toward the autumn years of the Fifth Astral Era, the civilization had begun perfecting void magics, the summoning and manipulation of creatures known as void sent from beyond the corporeal realm. A report by the scholars of the nominated observers of artifacts historical defines the void as an otherworld parallel to the one in which man dwells. Abnormal events can weaken the veil between worlds, tearing it asunder and allowing the void sent to invade the material realm. These fiends have a depraved appetite and seek our world merely to consume the aether it contains, allowing neither beast nor man to stand in their way. The mages of the Allegan Empire had previously experimented in forging covenants with the demons of the void in hopes of harnessing the creature's powers. The Machi expanded on this endeavor, adding extra protections to their experiments so as not to invite the same fate that befell the Allegans. To this end, the mages developed an occult device, the Null Stone, to preserve themselves and their city should a pact be broken. If a summoned void sent refused to obey the master, a void mage could smite the feral being using the Null Stone to sever its ties to the corporeal realm. It was in mastering this power that the Machi came to believe their civilization's supremacy over all others, eventually driving them to war. Powerful void sent were brought to heel via the Null Stone, reducing them to naught more than strategic weapons for the Machi military. A mage by the name of Caliph Steri obtained the power of an aether-infused crystal with the ritual consumption of void sent blood to achieve a twisted form of immortality that she might guard this artifact from those who might seek to destroy it. Creatures categorized in the upper rungs of the 12-tiered void sent hierarchy cannot pass through dimensional borders by way of an artificial tear. They instead require a willing vessel from the corporeal side, possessing their soul and entering the world by way of a summoning. The Null Stone has the capability to destroy that vessel and nullify the pact between it and the summoner, making it a powerful tool in maintaining control over even the most powerful of void sent. The ancient city of Amdapor. At the dawn of the Fifth Astral Era, a group of Hyur arrived in what is now the South Shroud. The area in which they settled was an open plain interspersed with massive outcrops of light-colored rock, distinctly bereft of the thick forest cover now associated with the region. The abundance of stone allowed the Hyur to erect exceptionally sturdy structures, and by the year 300, central Oldenard had transformed into the bustling city of Amdapor. The people of Amdapor attempted to commune with the enigmatic elementals of the Black Shroud, that they might partake in the bounty of the forest. The elementals, ever untrusting of men, declined any interaction with their new neighbors, content with the distance between them. The Amdapori respected this wish, and did not forcibly encroach upon the sacred holt, save for the occasional pursuit of quarry during a hunt. It is worth mentioning, however, that the elementals did not entirely shun outsiders during this period. Amicable relations were maintained with the Ixali tribes, the elementals allowing them ingress into the shroud upon deeming the beastmen no threat to the forest's natural balance. As their city-state prospered, the Amdapori focused on fortifying their domain, expanding their defenses by constructing an enormous stronghold atop a knoll outside the city proper. Paying reverence to Nofika, the goddess of abundance, they claimed to cherish harmony with nature, and promised their neighbors a peaceful coexistence. The societies in the surrounding vicinity benefited from this philosophy, and Amdapor was viewed not as a threat, but a respected elder watching over its 11 fellow cities. Thus did it become to be known as the Ancient City. Much of what remains of the city of Amdapor is slowly being swallowed by an ever-thickening blanket of mold and rot caused by an elemental imbalance lingering in the aftermath of the Seventh Umbral Calamity. Even so, archaeologists expect that decay will do little to destroy the ancient city's stone foundations, architectural feats which have already withstood more than a millennium and a half of nature's wrath. The discovery of white magic. The Amdapori initially harnessed basic magics for use in their city's defenses, drawing and expanding upon the primitive knowledge of golem creation to temporarily imbue stone statues with life. However, in the 9th century, mages of the ancient city bore witness to Mock's use of the destructive arts to subjugate neighboring city-states. Wary of their neighbors' ambitions, the Amdapori sought to counter these black magics by improving upon their own spellcraft, weaving with the intent to purify, ward, and heal, the art of white magic. It has been argued that without the discovery of white magic, Amdapor would likely have succumbed to Mock's ambitions. That the ancient city had developed a means to keep the black mages in check prevented the Maki army from waging a full-fledged assault on Amdapor, lest they too suffer grievous losses. Thus, for the next few centuries did Eorzea experience a fragile, yet lasting peace, fostered by the precarious balance between the two nations and their opposing schools of magic. Despite their sinister visage, demon walls are not void-sent, but forgekin, created by using a primal form of Amdapori white magic. By inscribing a stone wall with an arcane pattern of blood, these golems would spring to life to intimidate and repel trespassers. Carved during the Fifth Astral Era, this winged lion is an ensorcelled stone guardian, capable of manipulating white magic at its own will, a testament to the advancement of Amdapor's arcane capabilities. The peoples of Eorzea flourished in the peace brought about by the impasse between the black and white schools of sorcery, though war was on the horizon. Following in the footsteps of Mock and Amdapor, other city-states began developing their own forms of spellcraft in attempts to further their societies. This approach to the achievement of prosperity was vastly different than that taken by the Alligans of the Third Astral Era, eschewing technological growth for advancement of a more arcane nature. However, progress would come with a hefty price, as man would soon become drunk on the might that their arcane puissance would bring him. Societies built upon foundations of magic were forced to sacrifice their natural surroundings, as vast amounts of aether were drawn from the land in order to maintain the city's magnificence. The realm's enlightenment had become a double-edged sword. Each mage city maintained the facade of an edifying heritage, while secretly honing their offensive magics. One need not be an oracle to see that this interlude of peace would soon draw to an end. The mages of Mock silently turned their eyes to the dark, seeking to slake their expansionist ambitions by amassing an army of void-sent thralls. Amdapor kept their outward appearance as a rich bastion of arts and culture, but daunting sculptures of its guardians soon appeared in every corner of the city. While the actual catalyst for war remains lost to time, it is known that the frequency of political and military posturing between the two nations increased in dramatic fashion as the realm approached the mid-13th century, and ere long, the entirety of Eorzea became entangled in an inescapable web of strife. The War of the Magi had begun. The Wanderer's Palace was a massive stone temple dedicated to the Nimians' patron god Oshan, ruler of the mountains and protector of vagrants. It appears to be coincidence that Vilbrun's indigenous kobold tribes also worship the mountains, revering Mount Ogamoro as their sacred mother. But this commonality is believed to be why the Nimians were able to foster amicable relations with the Beastmen. The floating city of Nim. Near the 500th year of the Fifth Astral Era, scores of Lalafellan sailors arrived on Vilbrun's shores in longboats woven of reeds. Here, the mercantilists built a meager settlement on the southern part of the isle with hopes of establishing trade with the native kobold tribes. In time, their lonely outpost would grow into the maritime city of Nim. Nim's population was not as robust as the other 12 city-states, but what the Nimians lacked in ascendancy they made up for in commerce, making full use of their consummate skills in seafaring. Nim's sailors were a rough and rowdy lot, traits they used to their advantage in establishing the Royal Marines, a small yet fearsome naval force that was placed in charge of the city's defenses. Translations of Nimian records depict the Marines as axe-wielding marauders who would fight alongside a handful of talented mages who provided healing and support by way of their own uniquely developed brand of spellcraft. Despite their humble ranks, the Marines' tact proved their greatest strength, a great portion of Nim's legacy alluding to legends of their fierce martial prowess. Even during the Great War, the Royal Marines ensured that their small nation maintained its independence by valiantly repelling wave after wave of void scent sent by the Maquis across the Rothlet Sound. The Nimian Plague. The War of the Magi raged for nigh on 3 centuries before Nim was stricken by a mysterious plague, severely crippling the city-state. One common theory used to explain how the scourge was spread involves a curious story involving a band of Nimian sailors who had been cast adrift in the South Seas after their ship was battered by a fearsome storm. The disoriented seamen landed on a desert isle, where they met a native tribe of Lalafels who nursed them back to health and mended their broken vessel so they might return safely to Nim. Before the traders disembarked, the islanders bestowed upon them a parting gift, an ornate amphora. Not long after the sailors returned to the floating city and presented the token of friendship, Nim's people fell, one by one, to an incurable sickness heretofore unseen on Vilbrun. It was not until it was too late that Nimian scholars discovered the amphora to be part of an elaborate Maquis plan that would see the unleashing of Bitoso, a pestilence-carrying void scent summoned to Eorzea for the sole purpose of decimating the Nimian population. Those who contracted the void sense disease experienced disfiguring symptoms. Their nose and ears melted away, their limbs shriveled, and their flesh turned a ghastly shade of green. Attempts to contain the plague included isolation of the infected, who were locked away within the Wanderer's Palace, the sacred Nimian Temple of Oshan. The Nimians remained wholly unaware of Bitoso's cloaked presence, and even as the temple's halls became filled with the sick and dying, the plague continued to spread. Panic over the Green Death eventually drove the city-state's mages to their wits' end, leaving them with no choice but to take drastic measures. In a last fit of desperation, the mages used their magics to swell the land's waters, sealing the Wanderer's Palace as well as the fates of those trapped inside. Hysteria surrounding the plague would eventually consume the Nimians, leading their nation down the path of self-destruction. The Maquis were ready to reap the seeds of destruction they had sown. Many of those afflicted with the Nimian Plague were roused from a deep slumber when the protective barrier that for centuries had isolated the Wanderer's Palace from the outside world was shattered by the fallen shards of Development. With no knowledge of the plague and its disfiguring effects on skin and extremities, those early explorers of the recently surfaced temple claimed the ruins to be inhabited by Tonberries, mythical, rancorous creatures believed to stalk the shadows of night in search of revenge. Bitoso's ability to conceal his form left the Nimians guessing as to the actual cause of the plague that was consuming their city from within. By the time they had uncovered the truth, it was too late to save those who had fallen, both to the scourge itself and at the hands of the mages who had sought to quell it. The Battle of Amdapor. By the year 1510, the War of the Magi was nearing a climax as the Void Mages of Mach pushed ever closer to Amdapor. Despite having stood for centuries, Amdapor Keep, the ancient city's first line of defense, was quick to fall to Mach's fell army of otherworldly demons. With the gate to Amdapor laying open, the Void Mages heralded their arrival in the city proper with the summoning of Diabolos, a high-ranking void scent meant to seal Amdapor's fate. However, Mach sorely underestimated the defensive magics of Amdapor. To withstand Diabolos and the minions under his unholy command, the White Mages breathed life into the city's most powerful stone guardians. Gathering their collective strength, the Amdapori were able to seal away the Void Prince, forcing the Machi to withdraw. Yet while the ancient city may have triumphed that day, it was a hollow victory, for it did little to stall the sun as it set on this once great civilization. The era's darkest hour was nigh. The Machi march on Amdapor was not the sole case of Eorzea's downfall, or sole cause, rather. 3 centuries of ceaseless assault on the land had taken its toll, the drain of energies used to propagate war sending the realm's elemental balance askew. This final battle was merely the straw which saw the balance break. Only after the dust settled did the people of Eorzea begin to truly notice the damage they had wrought. The realm's most powerful seers were called to scry the realm's future, but what they foresaw was darkness. It was too late to amend their ways. A calamity was upon them, and soon the waters would rise to purge the land of those who had ravaged her so. Grafted and given life by the mages of Amdapor, Kuribu is one of the many guardian statues erected around the city to counter the Void Scent invasion. Using advanced techniques honed over centuries, the Amdapori were able to create a golem which had not only mastered martial artistry, but arcane spellcasting as well. The Machi had intended Diabolos to be their secret weapon in annihilating the Amdapori mages and toppling the ancient city. What they had underestimated was the desperation with which the White Mages would fight to defend their home, and the home of their children. Though many gave their lives in the task, Diabolos was eventually sealed deep beneath the city, and Amdapor was safe, for a time. Birth of the Grand Companies. Scholars and mages from all nations entreated their governments to, if not temporarily, set aside their differences and focus their attentions on the larger problem at hand. Monitoring of the realm's aether indicated an unhealthy imbalance toward water, suggesting the manifestation of a calamity-scale flood of epic proportions. The city-state's leaders could not long deny the evidence laid before them, and though begrudgingly at first, soon began to pool their resources, hastily creating central command centers to first and foremost address the protection of civilians from the coming deluge. These emergency forces would later become known as the Grand Companies. The Nimians, despite still reeling from the losses incurred by the plague, ordered their dwindling military forces out into the rising seas to construct an expansive floating net of protective wards dubbed Operation Maelstrom. Amdapor mobilized what remained of its military to commence the evacuation of the realm's people north to the mountains of Avalathia's spine, abandoning the city so many had recently given their lives to defend. The Arc of the Machi. As the Grand Companies of Mach and Amdapor enacted their contingency plans to evacuate their citizenry to higher ground, the Machi were looking beyond the mountains, well beyond. Confident in their ability to control any and all monstrosities wrested from the void, the city-state began construction of an airship known as the Ark, designed to run on the dark energies of an entire legion of void scent sealed within its hull. The rulers of Mach envisioned that the floating sanctuary would carry entire families and their livelihoods, livestock, seeds, supplies, into the skies, where they would wait in relative safety until the waters of the calamity had receded. Yet, even with a myriad of mindless thralls at their disposal, the Ark still required a core powerful enough to see the vessel to the heavens. Thus, the Void Mages sought the power of a void scent, the likes of which they had never before summoned. A ruler from one of the highest tiers of voidal hierarchy, Skahat, the Shadow Queen. Only a mage of strong mind could endeavor to control so potent a prisoner without the use of the Nullstone, which, by this time, had been lost to the rising waters. The responsibility was ultimately given to Cessair Blackwind, a high void mage of questionable repute and outspoken critic of the War of the Magi. Upon learning of the Ark and the means by which the Maki mages sought to power the vessel, Cessair voiced her vehement disapproval of the plan, claiming it reckless at best and deadly at worst. However, the rising seas that had already begun to swallow the realm left her little choice, and she reluctantly agreed to helm the plan, if only to save the lives of her people. Cessair and her cadre of 53 void mages boarded the Ark and successfully contained within a complex network of interconnected coffins the energies of Skahat and more than 50 score void sent. The vessel launched to the cheers of an entire nation, the hopes that their efforts would lead to the preservation of their society. The Ark and her passengers, however, were never to return. Despite the peerless talent of Cessair and her cadre, the overwhelming power of the Shadow Queen could not long be contained. The mage's grip on Skahat slowly loosened, and the lesser creatures under the Queen's command escaped their fetters. Free to roam the ship, the Voidsent took full advantage of the tight quarters to make quick work of the Maki citizenry. Fearing that a complete loss of control was inevitable, the High Void Mage and her loyal compeers chose to sacrifice their lives in one final attempt to redouble the seal on Skahat and return her minions to their coffins. With no surviving Void Mages, the familiar Ketshi was left alone aboard the masterless vessel as it wandered through the mists of the Sea of Clouds, where it has since been given a more ominous title, the Void Ark. Advancements in airship technology achieved in the late 6th and early 7th Astral Eras have given rise to increased numbers of expeditions into skies unknown. Reports from the expeditions of sightings of a massive ghost ship drifting aimlessly in the Sea of Clouds gave rise to an official investigation, which in turn resulted in the rediscovery of Mok's forsaken Ark, lost some 1,500 years past. Deep within the Void Ark's hull are stowed seemingly endless rows of stone coffins. These sarcophagi were not, however, funerary vessels used to inter the remains of the vessel's passengers, but containment units for Voidsent summoned by the Ark's architects. The coffins served as arcane foci to channel the dark energies of the creatures trapped within and divert them to the Ark's engines. The coffin displayed here is the massive stone cyst believed to once contain Skahat, the Shadow Queen. A powerful Voidsent, Skahat was summoned along with a 1,000-strong army of lesser minions to serve as the Ark's means of propulsion. The Void Mage's efforts to control the Queen and her servants, however, were met with disastrous results. Thus, the Sixth Umbral Era, the Calamity of Water. As both scholar and seer scried, the realm's elemental imbalance culminated in a far-reaching flood that eventually swept over Eorzea, and with the Calamity of Water did the Fifth Astral Era come to a close. Coastal towns were pummeled by tidal waves while rivers overflowed their banks, swallowing settlements and leaving inarable soils in their wake. The great city of Mok was swallowed whole by a torrent the likes of which the realm had heretofore never experienced. The few who remained drowned as they cast their eyes and hopes heavenward, content in the belief that the Ark would see the glory of their people endure. Those who had the sense to retreat to higher ground would return to Yefem to learn they were the inheritors of a wasteland of salt-clogged swamps, where even the hardiest of weeds refused to take root, let alone crops with which one might sustain a family. The few remaining Nimian citizens who had not been touched by the Green Death evacuated north into the mountainous regions of outer La Nosea, as the Royal Marines commenced their ambitious Operation Maelstrom. While the Grand Company was successful in turning back the largest of swells, the mages were unable to prevent the scores of subsequent waves from pulverizing their coastal city-state. Lands reclaimed by the sea were reduced to rocky reefs, leaving nary an home to which Nim's few survivors might return. As most of their land's energies had been exhausted in their efforts to seal Diabolos, there was little remaining for Amdapor's white mages to draw upon to stay the waters which had already enveloped the territories held by Nim and Mok. The alternative was a hurried exodus into the highlands of Girabania before the deluge reached the ancient city. The region abandoned, the elementals, who had quietly borne witness to the Amdapori people's rapacious consumption of the land's aether, saw to it that the city remnants be devoured in thick, sorcerous brush not long after the waters receded, thereafter preventing ingress into Amdapor. Thus did the ruins remain hidden from mortal eyes until the elementals' glamours were dispelled during the seventh calamity. It could be said that the greatest of Eorzea's magical civilizations succumbed to a chaos of their own contriving, yet it would be misguided to conclude that the entirety of mankind was beyond redemption for the sins of a few. Amidst the strife of the calamity and the subsequent Sixth Umbral Era, legends have long told of the advent of a band of saviors known as the 12 Archons, who helped to warn the people of impending doom and provide salvation to countless scores in their time of need. Without champions such as these, the path to the Sixth Astral Era may have been longer and more fraught with peril than it actually was. The Sixth Astral Era, Prosperity and Progress. Overcoming calamities of each of the 6 basic elements, the people of the Sixth Astral Era believed that the worst was behind them, and that the consequent era would foretell everlasting prosperity. We now know this was but a false hope, and that a 7th period of destruction awaited them almost 16 centuries hence. This still, however, begs the question: if the 6 basic elements were accounted for, why, then, did a 7th calamity arise? To find the answer, one must travel back to the dawn of the Sixth Astral Era, where man began his journey anew. The Age of Restoration, years 1 to 400. Scars left by the Sixth Umbral Era ran deep, instilling much despair into the hearts of the realm's few survivors. Fearing that its continued use might further their woes, the art of magic was widely forbidden. Libraries housing ancient tomes were put to flame, while those who practiced, or were rumored to practice, the art of spellcraft were hunted down and tried as criminals. Many a learned man met the same demise, as the masses had become so incensed they could no longer distinguish the difference between science and sorcery. With the majority of their greatest minds lost, the few remaining nations of the Fifth Astral Era crumbled and vanished, their people scattering about the realm to lay claim to what little resources remained. Driven by the primal urge to survive, tribes and clans banded together into small communities and began a centuries-long journey to rebuild their broken lives. Between the destruction wrought by the War of the Magi and that by the Calamity of Water, little remained of the Fifth Astral Era's city-states. Those who survived the chaos abandoned the shells of their once magnificent nations, choosing instead to establish small hamlets. The Age of Communion, years 400 to 1000. 400 years removed from the Great Deluge, Eorzea's population finally began to experience a resurgence. Immigrants from islands beyond the Blood-Brine Sea, as well as the eastern continents of Othard and Ilsilbard, arrived in Altenard in droves. 3 great migratory waves of Fure also inflicted irreversible change on Eorzea's population distribution. Racial tension reached its peak at this time, with individual races seen gravitating to certain city-states to escape persecution. The Elizin to Ishgard in the highlands of Coerthus, the Lullafel to Baladia in the deserts of Thanalan, and the Rogadin to Limsa on the Isle of Vilbrand. However, even this was not without its problems. It was only a matter of years before infighting amongst the Lullafelan royalty of Baladia resulted in the nation's fall and its bifurcation into 2 new city-states, Ul'dah and Sildih. This is not to say, however, that the period was devoid of racial harmony. Their banishment from the Black Shroud by the spirits of the forest worked towards strengthening the bonds between Hyur and Elizin living in the Black Shroud, ultimately leading to their joint establishment of the underground city of Gelmora. The ruins of Baladia. Descendants of Maki mages sought to escape persecution through the founding of Baladia. As a result, the forbidden black magics of their forebears did not die out, and were instead cleverly integrated into their worship of the sun goddess, Azemia. Ishgard. Ishgardian scripture teaches that King Thordan answered the call of Halone to lead his people to the promised land in Coerthus 1,000 years past, which would place the area's settlement around the latter half of the 6th century. This, however, has since been proven by historians to be erroneous, as newly unearthed evidence dates the Elazon's arrival to Coerthas at least 200 years earlier. The Age of Strife, years 1000 to 1300. For the next several hundred years, the city-states exhibited steady progress as they continued to grow and gain power. When they sought to expand their claim on surrounding lands, however, new complications arose. Territorial feuds betwixt neighbors led to heightened tensions on the outlands. Indigenous beast tribes such as the kobolds and the Ixal, infuriated with those whom they perceived as invaders, began to rise in defiance, despoiling the land in protest. Unable to put aside their differences, Ul'dah and Sildeh waged a petty war until neither side could remember why it was they fought at all. As bloody battles broke out across the realm, the balance of power began to shift once more. Rivers ran with blood while coin flowed from the hands of the ambitious into the pockets of mercenaries and sellswords. Ul'dah emerged as rulers of Thanalan after finally conquering their city-state and reducing it to rubble. The warring tribes of Giribania were at long last brought together by the Highland Hieroclan and joined to form the city-state of Alamigo. Advancements in shipbuilding techniques strengthened Limsa-Lominsa's dominion over the seas, while increased dealings with the lands beyond Eorzea transformed the maritime city-state into a wealthy melting pot of cultures. After many long years of developing the art, the people of Gelmora finally succeeded in using conjury to achieve communion with the spirits of the Black Shroud, and convinced the elementals to grant them residence in the forest. It is also at this time that the spirits, angered by the violent actions of the Ixal, sent the tribe into exile beyond the Black Shroud's protective barrier, the Hedge. Free to emerge from their underground refuge and rid of the troublesome Ixal, the people of Gelmora established a new city-state, Gridania. Not all residents of Gelmora chose to leave the caves in which their people had resided for centuries, expressing distrust towards the elementals who had driven them underground in the first place. Those few Elazon who refused to leave the city would, in time, become known as the Duskwights. The Age of Stability, years 1300 to 1500. Weary of fighting, the people of Eorzea sought to mend bonds that had grown torn and frayed over the centuries. Aggressive tactics were abandoned for diplomacy, and intercity-state commerce was restored. As technology and culture were shared, the nations experienced a prosperity unseen since the Fifth Astral Era. The city-states of Limsa-Lominsa, Gridania, Ul'dah, Ishgard, Alamigo, and Sharlayan matured and became the focal points of Eorzean civilization. Peace, for once, prevailed in the land. However, the opening of these doors eventually led to the closing of others. Fearing their livelihood would be lost or altered by the influx of new people and ideas, independent craftsmen and warriors alike began banding together to preserve their trades. They formed guilds, not only to safeguard their knowledge, but to provide themselves with the wherewithal to form business partnerships, which would help assure their financial stability. Unfortunately, where man treads, peace is never long to last. In an attempt to expand their influence into the Black Shroud, Alamigo exploited the realm's illusion of security by launching a series of large-scale campaigns into Tinoka, which would eventually lead to the onset of the Autumn War. The Sharlayans, who traversed south and east into northern wastes to settle in Eorzea, brought with them a wealth of knowledge long lost. Seeking to resuscitate the wisdom of the ancients and re-enlighten the Dark Realm, the scholars were tireless in their efforts. For example, it was through their intervention that Eorzeans were once again able to harness the teleportive properties of Aetherites, the construction of the Aethernet being part of this legacy. The Rise of Garlemalt, years 1500 to 1560. What little magics the Gridanians perfected in the generations since their departure from Gelmora were no match for the sheer martial might of the Alamigan forces, and it appeared the Sylvan city-state would quickly fall to her invaders. However, in a move most unexpected, the city-states of Ishgard, Ul'dah, and Limsa-Lominsa dispatched their armies to Gridania's aid, and just as quickly as the Autumn War began, so it was resolved. Borders were set and treaties signed. City-states would remain independent, but the rise of one would not be tolerated, and thus peace once again settled over the realm. Outside Aldenard, the flames of conquest began to rise. To the north, on the continent of Ilsebard, the Republic of Garlemalt was overwhelming nearby nations with their iron war machina, seizing their land and consuming their cultures. In the year 1552, the leader of the Republic, Solus Galvus, declared Garlemald an empire and appointed himself emperor. The new imperial army, now swelling with the might of countless assimilated nations, methodically subjugated the eastern continent of Othard and the remaining lands of Ilsebard, welcoming those nations willing to bow to imperial rule, while erasing those which refused the Garlean standard. With 2 of the 3 great continents now under its control, the Garlean Empire set its sights on Aldenard, and in the year 1557 sent the 14th Legion to conquer Alamigo in the first step to bring Eorzea's people under imperial rule. And that is where we'll wrap up for now. So, it looks like next time we'll be moving onward from the rise of the Garlean Empire, and there's a lot more to go. So, if you're interested in supporting the channel, if you enjoyed things, definitely make sure to subscribe and hit that bell below. You can also find me on Twitch on Saturdays to participate in the reading stream and the chats between live, and on Twitch Tuesday, Wednesday, and Thursday playing games like Fate Grand Order, Final Fantasy XIV, Tales of Vesperia, and more. So, hopefully I get to see more of you guys, and I'll see you in the next video.